Hi, you're listening to Tangents, a podcast from Coin Center. I'm your host for this week, Peter Van Valkenburgh, the Director of Research at Coin Center. And today I'm honored to have as my guest Daniel Buchner, who is a product manager for Decentralized Identity at Microsoft. Daniel, welcome to Coin Center's Tangents.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Yeah. So I wanted to have you on. You were like part of my original first few guest lists when we started, because I think the topic of decentralized identity is woefully under-discussed, both in the cryptocurrency community, which we take as our assumed audience for this podcast. But this podcast is also supposed to be about larger topics that are sort of crypto adjacent, or if you would say tangential to cryptocurrencies. And so the topic of identity has fascinated me since I started working at Coin Center, at the very least, because it's just so bad. Like internet identity systems are so terrible. And it seems to me like maybe one of the only, maybe 2 or 3 use cases for open blockchain networks that actually makes sense. Like usually you're just going to actually want an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of things. But in a certain few cases, you actually want a decentralized network and all of the sort of technical debt and heaviness that comes with that, but it'll be worth it because nobody controls this stuff, right? So thank you for coming on the show. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you first got interested in Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I was working at Mozilla at the time. This was, around 2011. And, I'd always worked on web technologies and, browser stuff. And, but in the background, it was sort of like, I was interested in a lot of different peer-to-peer stuff because as a libertarian, I, was always a fan of decentralized technologies. When I had saw that at, Mozilla, I was introduced to it by a buddy. It was interesting to me, but I certainly didn't, in 2011, when I first became aware of it, think it was going to be, this big thing. Cause, I'd seen earlier versions of it, like things that Adam Back and everyone had done, I was aware of like the background, but, so it was funny, my buddy sold me like a few Bitcoin for like the price of a cheap sandwich, like back then. Yeah. And it was just like, they were just like for pennies or whatever. And I, oddly enough, did not buy a lot of Bitcoin. I kind of was like, oh, I'm going to play around. So I sent some test transactions and whatever. And I was just like, I didn't treat it that seriously, but I believed in it. And it really was an interesting thing at the time. And the first time I started thinking about it in terms of identity was very rudimentary. But back when the colored coins phenomenon happened, and there was that video of the gecko that was like licking coins, and he would like turn them a different color, and then they'd like
remember
say,
that
one. I was like, oh yeah, you could like have the gecko like lick something about identity on those coins, like maybe public keys, and that was kind of the first inception event of it all.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of our first backgrounders on our websites was on the colored coin notion because it was very interesting. In retrospect, it's a terrible name, just because it sounds weird and confusing. But the basic premise is awesome, because if you have this peer-to-peer system for moving little bits of value around, there's a few other things that you might want to be able to move around in a peer-to-peer system. And I agree, identity is totally one of them. Yeah, I'm with you. I think I also found out about Bitcoin in 2011 and never stopped kicking myself for not like taking it a little bit more seriously. Like I played with it. I was like, this is cool. And Jerry and I were both like interested in it from a legal perspective back then, but like didn't buy a bunch. Anyway.
I still have a mortgage. Yeah. Every day I look at these numbers on this, I'm just like, oh, stupid you.
I don't know. I think you're faking it. I think you have a ton, and this is just obstacle because you're an identity-minded guy, and you're like, I want the internet to know.
I wouldn't be on this podcast. I went on Shinobi's, and he doesn't even show his face. I don't know who he is. So
you don't just like me. You wouldn't just come on the podcast because you like me. All right. So that's interesting. I didn't know you were at Mozilla. That makes a lot of sense now. And this is another question I want to ask you that kind of leads into this. When did the move to Microsoft happen? And I don't know, as an outsider who doesn't work for Microsoft, I've perceived over the last 5-10 years a pretty radical shift in philosophy towards free and open source software at Microsoft, that if you told me that was going to happen like 10-15 years ago, I would have been like, yeah, that's never going to happen. So like, when did you come to Microsoft, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I actually started a project at Mozilla, in 2012. We call it, never made it out of like the internal, bucket of projects, but it was called Firefox Handshake. And the idea was, use an open system, Bitcoin or otherwise, to have a DPKI infrastructure whereby users could have many IDs and privately and securely exchange like peer-to-peer interactions and of all types. And so that was kind of the formation of it. And I always had other work to do, like web platform type work to do, developer ecosystem work to do, but that was always the thing that I wanted to do. And so I kind of privately kept messing with it ever since 2012. And then in 2015, I got this call from a friend who had gone to Microsoft, and he said, "Hey, we've got a ton of Edge, opportunities in the Edge browser. That whole group is spinning up. You should maybe think about coming over here." And in my mind, I was like, okay, yeah, I could certainly work on new browser stuff, but I was like, I sort of did the math, and I was like, if we wanted to do this identity thing and we're serious about it, and most people don't know this, but I didn't know it before I looked into it, who are the players who I could advance not my career with, next, but this thing?
Yeah.
As I began digging, Microsoft, it turns out, is the identity, essentially backend infrastructure for 95% of the Fortune 10,000 and the vast majority of companies in the space. Huh. So just about everyone you name has an Azure Active Directory piece in their infrastructure, which they use for login and auth. So if you were going to start somewhere, you really, your choices are essentially Google, Facebook, Apple, or Microsoft. And obviously Microsoft is the more business side of things, but that drives enough, that it's a good choice. Some of the names on that list would not probably enjoy decentralized identity. They probably would be the opposite of that. But it turns out Microsoft is really the perfect host, because they have the reach, they have the scale, and they're not innately adverse to the ramifications of the adoption of decentralized identity. It might seem strange, but they're just not. No, the downside isn't the same. I would assert. So in 2015, I kind of figured that out. I actually had a call before I accepted the position, which was completely unrelated to identity, with some of the folks in the decentralized blockchain identity community, and told them I was thinking about doing this. It was a few companies that I don't want to disclose them, but they're still around today. Yeah. And I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. We should all do it together. Like, I'll just go in there and I'll see if I can get into the right position. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, I accepted the position. And day 2, they flew me. I immediately had to fly out for this build conference. And they were introducing Windows 10. And I was supposed to speak about Edge. I didn't know anything about Edge at that point. I just worked with Firefox. So they're like, Chrome. Day 2. Yeah. They're like, day 2, go talk about Edge. And this is the one before it was Chrome. So it was even more obscure. So I was like, oh, okay, I know nothing. So I talked about all these vanilla web APIs, but I'm sitting in the green room. And this guy, this older gentleman, he's 55, 60. I can't, don't know his age exactly. He turns to me. He's like, well, so what do you really want to do at Microsoft? And, I just was 2 days on the job, and my job had nothing to do with identity. And I turned to him and said, well, my secret maniacal plan is to get in a good position to decentralized identity and bring decentralized apps of communication to everyone at scale, and then deprecate all this other crap we have. And he's like, oh, do you remember who I am? I was like, well, not really. And then he explained, I was like, are you peers with my boss? Do you know my boss? He's like, yeah, I know your boss, because I'm your boss's boss's boss. And he's like, it's good to know. I knew you were coming on for your second day. So I was like, oh, that's super awkward. I was like, I didn't mean any of that. I'm super happy to be working on this Edge stuff. So just think about that. And so about a year into it, I had advocated steadily over that year's time to get into the identity org, to pitch them on this stuff. And I had this opportunity. It was kind of blowing me off a little bit, but this opportunity about 6 months in, to have an audience with sort of the VP that runs that, plus this guy, Kim Cameron, who, if you know about the identity world, Kim Cameron wrote The Laws of Identity. He's kind of like the paramount in the industry. So I was sitting there with the VP and Kim, and I said, you got to do this. You have to. Your identity business can't even grow in certain areas unless identity is owned by people. And Kim believed it. He convinced David Treadwell at the time, who is now at Amazon, to say, let's do it. So I switched organizations. The actual plan I had before joining, somehow made its way, and switched organizations. The identity org was given the ability to start the project. And we've just been, really pursuing it since about 2017. in earnest, and we're getting near the final paces.
That's awesome. That's a lot that I didn't know. And, I can see the incentive alignment actually. And I agree with you. There isn't incentive alignment at some of the big players that you mentioned. I mean, you can just take a look at what Facebook came out with when they're proposing digital cash. They're like, oh, well, it'll be Libra and it'll be a consortium. And it's like, really? Not that Facebook hasn't done good things in this space, but Libra is kind of a thorn in our side now because everybody in government is angry about it. And sometimes for the right reasons, because it's like, who's in the Libra Association? It's like, yeah, well, that was a choice to choose who's in the Libra Association. But with enterprise and with Microsoft, I do actually get it, because this is something that's come up a few times in, say, the Zcash privacy coin space. When we have to explain why this tech is necessary and not just a tool for criminals, some of our best ammunition comes from the fact that like JP Morgan's actually playing with this tech, because if you're really involved in enterprise, you've got a lot of trade secrets, you've got a lot of very sensitive information that you will be liable for if you lose it. And those are the people who take privacy most seriously. Unfortunately, end users of technology don't always take privacy very seriously because they don't know how bad things can get if their identity gets stolen and things like that. Or because somebody, maybe Facebook, maybe somebody else, is marketing a quick and easy solution to them that's maybe not best for their privacy. But I totally get it. On the enterprise level, Microsoft's got clients who care. And so it's easier to convince them that they've got to adopt this. Honestly, I mean, it's sort of an insane system. And we'll get into what like decentralized identity means, but it's a radical change. But you can convince somebody who's got a lot on the line that a radical change is necessary, whereas convincing like the guy who's logging into Instagram with a lousy password that they got to change is kind of hard.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I should underscore that, for us, the interesting thing about identity is that today, most digital companies that will build themselves as digital identity companies or identity companies, IAM, that sort of thing, they aren't really dealing in identity. What they're dealing in primarily is either usernames, passwords, and fingerprints to get into some remote account.
Right.
And it's just account data. It's not even really, it's supposed to be attached to you as a person. It's not really your identity. It's kind of stodgy. Like, let's be honest. Most of identity isn't digitized at all. Most of identity is in silos. Most of identity is in one-off pieces of paper. And it's a crazy system. It's essentially like if basically paper letters to email like outran where the identity system that should have underpinned it should be now, right? By 20 years, 30 years. Like if we're sitting on the Star Trek Enterprise, in the year 2500, and someone's like, I'm trying to get into 10 forward to get some drinks, and everything's digitized except I hand the dude a card. That's insane, right? Like you'd just be like, that's probably not true. Like that's probably not going to be the way it goes down. But that's how it still is today. It's because we've never had the standards. We've never had the ability, not just the standards, but the ability for people to own the information in a way that wasn't just incredibly creepy, to be quite honest. So,
yeah, are you a Battlestar Galactica fan, Daniel?
That is one that I never got into, but like Star Wars, Star Trek, like for sure.
So. It's also one that I haven't gotten into. So now we're going to do the podcast where two guys talk about Battlestar Galactica, having not seen it. But Jerry, my boss, is a huge fan. And so he made me watch there's like an opening movie. And I didn't get into it enough. I gotta revisit it and watch the whole thing. But the basic premise is really interesting. There's this one ship that is like the last bastion of human civilization. And it's because it didn't interconnect with computer systems that ultimately became corrupt. And so like the data security and isolation aspect of it is really interesting. So I'm probably somebody who's a big Battlestar Galactica fan is like, Peter doesn't know what he's talking about, ignore him. But like, we should both watch it because I agree, like sci-fi portrayals of information security are usually just awful. But also point to like exactly what we should have been building for the last 20 years, probably. Anyway,
absolutely.
So decentralized identity, a huge topic. And I'm sorry to do this to you, but like, what's the elevator pitch? What's in a nutshell to somebody who is maybe familiar with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but hasn't made the connection to how we could have identity credentials or things like that using.
Yeah. So much like you like the security of your value. I would assume, your earned labor value, you probably would like the security of who you are to the world, whether it's public, private, or semi-private, as well as what you say and the other things. These are all identity things. I'd posit to you that the world of value is actually very small, right? I don't go around making transactions all the time to buy things, but I do identity transactions constantly. We're doing one right now. I logged into a system. I'm sending you bytes that I guess are supposed to be encrypted soon, Zoom.
We pay for premium, so I think
I hope so, right? But all these transactions we do every day with apps and services are not our own. We log in with foreign IDs that can be taken from us. We see that on Twitter all the time. People are suspended. You're cut off from your ID. And the content is no longer associated with you. Now, sometimes you want content to be associated, sometimes you don't, but you want control over it. And today you don't have control. So that's really what decentralized identity is about, is giving you identifiers, which just think of like your handle, things you can use, ways to prove that you own those identifiers, and then ways to secure the communications you do between them.
Yeah. There's a useful sort of academic concept that has always been valuable to me in explaining just not even decentralized identity, just the importance of privacy and identity systems in general. It comes from Professor Nussbaum at NYU. It's contextual integrity. Like what we really want is what we have in the real world, where we have context and we have the ability to affect how we present ourselves based on context. Like if I'm at the dentist's office, I'm not leaking information about my love life, but I am sharing information about my health issues, And that's easier to do in the physical world because we sort of can control what we selectively reveal to the world in a granular fashion. And because we have physical credentials often, like medical records or other things that we can actually atomistically share or choose not to share. But on the digital realm, it's all garbage. Like we have a tendency to just either share everything because of poor security or poor operational security, where we think we don't need to secure things. Or we can't even validate ourselves when we do want to actually share some information because the systems aren't interoperable. Like you mentioned that this is an identity exchange or transactions happening right now. And you're right. And as you pointed out before we started the recording, I was having trouble logging into Zoom because we've just switched accounts. And to Zoom, it's like now I'm a different person sometimes when I'm logged in and when I'm using the free version. And that's nuts because the system is not built to be seamless, not built to be intuitive like context in the real physical world actually is.
Yeah, it's really good that you bring that up. It actually leads into one, sort of semi-technical thing that illustrates your point, which is DIDs. It's not meant to be just with like one ID.
This is a decentralized ID.
Decentralized identifier. It's a W3C spec. It's headed towards standardization. We hope in the next year it's all the way down the track. But it codifies the PKI, the data formats for decentralized identifiers, which are the strings you use to kind of say, hey, this is me and I can prove it. But people get creeped out because they think, well, oh no, I don't want just one ID because, it's like the super cookie and everyone's going to see it and they'll tie everything to me. And that is not the concept. Mm-hmm. You can have IDs, like you said, for all the contexts in your life. I might meet someone and I want them to be able to refer to me by an identifier just in our personal scope. So I'll create a new one and I'll give it just to them. And then when I want to talk to them, I exchange information or messages over that conduit encrypted with those keys, which is wholly separate from maybe what I would typically call a public persona DID. So my belief is that everyone in the world might have one or two or whatever, a small amount of public persona DIDs. And those are the kind of IDs you might use openly in social, scenes. Same thing you do for Twitter. Like, I want this tied to me. I want to say something publicly. I want you to know my resume. I'll put it here. Maybe I don't even have to put it on a centralized website that some large company owns. And that's the goal, right? Is to give you control over the atomicity of your exchanges and the ultimate power to have exactly what you talked about.
Yeah. So why is this relevant to blockchain networks, to things like Bitcoin or Ethereum or what have you? Do you really need those types of technology to achieve this? I'm sold that you absolutely need a blockchain to do like atomistic value exchange, to actually own your own value and send it to somebody else. But I've heard people sometimes say in the identity space, you really just need like PKI, you need public key infrastructure. You don't need the blockchain part. Is there a grain of truth to that? What's the relevance of blockchain?
So what I would say is PKI certainly, absolutely is a must in any identity system. And PKI, for people listening, is just the ability to take an identifier and tie it with a current state of like some public keys, private key, stuff that is associated with it, where I could use those private keys to prove that I own the ID. Mm-hmm. So at the core of every system of identity is usually a system like that. Now, where blockchains and systems like it come into play is the fact that PKI is not concerned with double spend in the same way that value is, but it is concerned with time linearization. So PKI, you always have to know that when I dial up this ID, I'm getting the right state of the key material and the routing data that allow me to both authenticate and connect to this person. Because if I'm not getting the current state, say I'm getting an old state where a key was rolled off that was, tied to my old phone, and now I put, a new one on, you could be subject to attack. So there is this sense where everyone has to see and understand the same linear history. Like if Alice got an ID and it started at state 0 and she transitioned to state 1, everyone has to be aware of that if she's dialable, because they have to dial up the correct state. And essentially what we use the blockchain to do in the open, public, and permissionless ION network that we're helping craft is using Bitcoin really as a linear chronological oracle. It's essentially an oracle system whereby people inject these aggregated events and the blockchain essentially smooths them out into one line. And we don't need the same double spend transfer, but we have to have everything in a deterministic order. Right. So it's really about order that matters in PKI systems.
So sometimes people explain Bitcoin as, and the Bitcoin blockchain as valuable because it creates a single source of truth. Like there's always the possibility of momentary forks, but because of the incentives for miners and because of the way the protocol is specified, it will ultimately resolve into a single linear history of transactions that are valid. And you're right that with Bitcoin, we care maybe most about not having two transactions that try to spend the same amount, the double spend problem. But we do also care about the order of payments. Like this transaction happened 5 blocks ago, this transaction happened just recently. And so you're saying that with identity, what we care most about as far as why we would need a blockchain is that we want this sort of one-way linear list of things sequentially so that we know, is it sort of like, I've explained it this way, and I'm always a little bit unsure if I'm being as accurate as possible. Is it sort of like, as a more like human way to think of it, that you've got a transaction, an identity transaction where someone gave you a credential at one point. They said like, this person is licensed to drive in Virginia. And then maybe you had too many DUIs or something and the credential gets revoked. That's the kind of thing we would need to know absolutely, that these two events happened in a certain order, because then maybe the credential gets returned again. Is that accurate?
No, so actually you bring up a really good point of clarification. Mm-hmm. In ION and most of these decentralized identifier systems, nothing about the person's identity ever goes on the blockchain.
Right.
How ION sort of works is like, let's say I'm Alice, I create an ID. So I create the first state. And when I talk about state, I'm not talking about any verbose identity, PII sort of information. It's just the keys, maybe one to my laptop, my phone, and a couple routing endpoints where you could find me that are in this small bundle that the DID spec defines. And so I started in state 0, and I can either ground it into Bitcoin myself via this hash, an IPFS hash, or I can give it to someone else who's running a node. And because it's signed by the keys that, they can't take my keys, it's signed by me. The worst someone running a node that's aggregating these assertions can do, these PKI state updates, is not put it in, right? It's the worst. And you could tell it's like tamper, obvious. So, but most time it's going to work. Like Microsoft's going to run one of these nodes. You send some signed update op that says, hey, roll this key and put this key on. We batch it together. We create an IPFS hash for it, and we insert it in Bitcoin's app return. And what happens is, as you're reading through the chain, you hit these IPFS hashes, you grab the data, and you synthesize the state. You basically weave it together. Alice has a series of deltas, and each delta is a modification. Mm-hmm. And if you process them all, you get the right answer. Now, what you talked about, credentials, transactions, text messages, all that stuff happens at a third layer.
It's an abstraction from that Okay.
Exactly. So you're just going to, the chain and ion are only about grounding your identifiers and keys. And then when you go to send a message, that's just on terrestrial infrastructure. You're just saying like regular normal infrastructure where you encode a message and you could send it to an HTTP URL, right? It's encrypted and signed so no one can see it. And that's the scale freedom that these identity systems allow for. But it's also a protection mechanism because you would never want credentials or anything like that on the blockchain.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We always get inquiries from folks in Congress where someone's come to them and said, like, I've heard that putting health data on the blockchain would make it more secure. And my head starts to explode a little. Like, really? You want a global peer-to-peer network to know that you've got type 2 diabetes? I don't know if that's what you want. But so what you're saying, and this is hard to conceptualize. What you're saying is that there's real facts about people, there's real credentials, there's real information, and that will still be exchanged in some way on what you'd call terrestrial networks. Which is,
I don't know, stupid word, but regular traditional infrastructure, yes. I suppose.
Yes, and the only thing that they're going to the blockchain for, or through Ion to the blockchain for, is for a sort of clock to say that like a particular otherwise indecipherable piece of data happened at point X and then later happened at point N after that. And
Bitcoin is serving as proof. So it orders these batches. So if Alice over her lifetime has, like, say for one of her IDs, she has 10 different operations, create a bunch of updates. The first one is a whole operation. Each individual one thereafter is a delta. It just might be like doing a little snippet, sort of like CRISPR, but for her identity state.
So can you give me like a specific? So the first operation, why is she doing this? Like what?
So she wants to create a new ID for some purpose. Like it's like, hey, you know what? I want to create a new public persona ID for my new decentralized social media activities, right. And I want it all tied to me. So I'm going to give this one out to everyone. Or hey, you know what? I'm at this conference. I just want to create an ID just to be this person right for this conference. And I might even never use it again, right? So all those reasons she might create an ID. So she fires up, the little piece of code on her wallet app, probably that's going to handle. It's just like kind of a Bitcoin wallet
because it's got a secure keys, basically. That's
exactly, and it generates all the necessary data, and it might project it out right to someone who's going to anchor it, or herself if she's willing to pay the fees. Could get expensive, and they go ahead and anchor it. Now it's resolvable. Because every one of the Ion nodes is watching Bitcoin, and they're essentially looking for specially encoded transactions to pick up those IPFS hashes and find the data. Mm-hmm. And one of those pieces of data is Alice's state that's sitting in this big bundle. And they pull it down. They say, great, this is Alice's first state. But as she changes her state over time, she incrementally changes things about it. And what is necessary is that all those states happen in a linear fashion, mm-hmm. so that when the nodes watch and pull the data, they zip it up in the correct
So can you give an example of what the state change might mean to Alice or whoever?
Yeah. So Alice has a phone right now that a key is tied to, or one of her keys is tied to a phone. And she says, you know what? And this could be like a hardware secure key. So there's many ways you can do this, but she throws the phone away or something and wants to, associate a new key. She would do a small delta update. She'd say, I don't want to change my whole state, all my keys. Maybe there's 5 of them. I just want to remove this one and insert this one. So she makes a tiny update and she sends that out. And then all the nodes that have processed all the previous state and understand what her current one is, see this new inbound change, which is directing them to say, do surgery on Alice's state, remove this key, add this one. And now you have the current state that she wanted. And everyone can be globally aware of that.
I'm pushing you though to give me like an easy example to share with a more lay person. Like
okay,
what did Alice? What in the world of Alice, who's non-technical, change that made her want to make that state change?
Okay, so like I said, she got the new phone, but the first thing she wants to do is tweet on Twitter, right? Yep. So or Twitter, whatever the hell the decentralized thing's going to be called. And so if she just tried to use her new phone, right, her new phone is not associated with her public persona ID, right, with which she's going to sign these tweets so that everyone knows this is still her, right? It's not this impersonator who's trying to get 100 Bitcoin, to some strange wallet. It's actually her. If she tried to do it on this brand new phone, it's not associated yet with that ID. So she's not going to think about it. Her wallet's going to say, great, fire up this brand new phone. Hey, by the way, I got to do this obscure process that, Dan talked to Peter about on this podcast one time. And it's going to go do that in the background. And magically her phone is now reconnected her ID, and she can, do her tweets just as normal.
So in this example, it's kind of like logging into Twitter on a new phone, but it's a lot better in certain ways because it's not. Well, explain why it's better.
Okay, so here's why it's better, right? We've all seen this happen on Twitter, and I like Jack. I'm neutral towards everyone involved there. I mean,
it's gotten kind of crazy though.
There's things I would change. Yeah. Let's just say there's things I would change. But there's other positive things too. So one thing we've seen is people just straight up get banned. Like you're gone, right? I think it's a matter of digital human rights. It's fine for people not to listen to you. It's perfectly fine for people not to listen to you. It's a whole nother story when you delete what is essentially someone's digital representation in a world where the digital self is becoming more and more important every day.
That's interesting. Yeah.
That scares me. So I would rather have apps that sort of talk to people and get tweets directly from users. And if you don't want to listen to someone, you don't tell some centralized authority, delete their ID from the world. You say, nope, and you just stop listening. Yeah. And that's what DIDs make possible, because what they can't do is ever take away your tweets, because those are stored in your personal application data store. They can't ever erase your ID from the world. So you can just connect to all your peers still, all the ones that still want to talk to you.
Right. Yeah. So the difference between Alice gets a new phone and signs something with a wallet with private keys that enables her to prove to the rest of the world that these are my decentralized tweets, versus Alice getting a new phone and logging in to Twitter is that she can always do that thing on her own if it's a decentralized ID system. She can, as long as she still has the private keys associated with her identity, and there should be ways to back them up and have those switch out old ones for new ones. But as long as she retains some core amount of data, she can always prove to the world that what I'm saying now with this new device is part of a continuous line of me speaking to the world. Whereas if you get a new phone and you try to log into Twitter and Twitter suddenly decides, you know what? We don't want your voice on this platform anymore. The identity aspect is just being performed by Twitter, where they wait for you to give the right, answer to the challenge question, which is usually like, what's your password? Here's my password. And so if Twitter decides not to validate your password and let you log in, you can't log in, but you can always do that decentralized identity calculation where you just sign a statement using cryptographic controls that allows you to speak to the rest of the world.
And another really good example using Twitter is, kind of that thing that happened, the unfortunate hack where, socially engineered or not, where someone was able to essentially tweet out things on behalf of your ID. That certainly can't happen anymore, because they can't get a hold of your private keys that are on your phone, which they need to appear valid as that ID, instead of just saying whoever is behind a keyboard at the time typing from headquarters gets to be literally probably maybe the president of the United States if they wanted to be for a time.
Yeah. That was an incredible hack, right? And Niraj has a habit of like finding things right when they happen. He's our director of communications, and he like immediately was like, "Oh my God, X is tweeting about Bitcoin and it's a scam," or X is tweeting about this scam coin and things like this. And it was everybody. I mean, I can't remember. Like Elon was one of the first ones because he's got like a influential Twitter account to say.
I feel like Niraj probably knew right away because his account stopped posting dank memes. So he was like, "This seems way too legit. These posts going out. I know this isn't Niraj."
But you bring up an important point. So that hack happened again, and maybe I'm being too overly expressive in simplifying this for our audience, because our audience is sophisticated. But the Twitter attack happened because anybody who had the power to log into Twitter's administrative controls could simply decide to effectively, and I don't know if this is exactly how it happened, but effectively pretend to be anybody, because it's always just Twitter who decides who is who based on did they log in correctly with the correct password. And you can compare that to the kind of security model you'd have in a decentralized Twitter, where you don't have control over any set of people. You only ever have control over the identities that are associated with keys that you control. And in a decentralized identity landscape, every individual has their own keys, which means you have to hack everyone to have control over everyone's identity instead of just hacking Twitter's administrative console.
Correct.
But it's the same thing we say with respect to why Bitcoin's kind of better than traditional banking, is that if you hack Bank of America, you can commit fraud on any Bank of America account. But in order to hack every Bitcoin wallet, you'd need to hack thousands, tens of thousands of people, assuming people are using self-hosted wallets rather than using Coinbase or something like that. But even if some small number are, this is a huge improvement.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another use case I would draw to kind of assert one thing that we did with digital without decentralized identity. It's a perfect platform for neutral content and digital lies, but it always obscures the truth because the truth is the eye's beholder, right? And you can't know for certain what came from where. But with decentralized identity, or I think a really good use case for it is something like really well recognized and hopefully neutral, somewhat news agencies that might have like, on the ground reporters and photographers can sign credentials that say, hey, like for instance, I'm the Associated Press. These people are credentialed reporters for me. Now you can decide how much you trust what they report, but they can at least say, yes, I, as the reporter with my own ID, can prove that AP says I'm a photographer, right? So when I take a photograph of a war-torn area, right? We always have these debates. Is it real? Who's it coming from? Was it put out by the regime? Right? The minute I take the photograph, I can sign it with the keys that tie to my DID, which are linked to the credential that says I'm an AP reporter. And when it gets populated all over the internet, there can be a small signature in the HTML tag that points to my ID and the relevant credential that prove that the bytes that were signed by the reporter themselves came from someone that was an AP photographer and haven't been manipulated a single pixel. And I think that decentralized identity gives us the innate ability to tell the digital truth to a certain degree that we don't have today.
I'm sure it's not a silver bullet because
no.
Whenever you get to squishy things like
truth, justice in the American way.
Yeah. You can only get so much improvement, but I see your point. So like, it seems as though you could have better reputation systems down the road if things like this took off, because a reporter is not just their resume and what their previous employers have said about them. A reporter could actually just be quite literally the bytes that they've published through other entities, but signed directly themselves with a persistent identity that they always control, rather than their employer, New York Times or whoever, controlling that sort of byline, if you will.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, because people often get scared when you say this word credentials because of some of the medical related stuff it's been associated with in today's COVID age. But I really want to reinforce that a credential is not pigeonholed to one industry or vertical. A credential is simply a signed bag of data, signed bits that you take your DID keys and sign over, and all you're saying is, I sign this. That's it. Yep. Who knows what it is? If you're a medical institution or a university with a diploma, you can make all sorts of different statements about people that you want to. This just gives us the ability to tie it back to a DID. And when you brought up reputation systems, you're 100% right. That's just all credentials, pretty much all the way down. A 5-star rating is nothing more than a credential that says, I give you this value out of 100, says me, right? And then I hand it to you, and you could take that and say, see, I did a good Lyft ride. Decentralized Lyft ride. It was 5 out of 5. And Dan says so, this idea over here. And so you can kind of, if you had a decentralized reputation network, stitch together all those credentials of reputation and say, yeah, I think based on what people have said about you, you're a trustworthy person. Because trust is a gradient, and it's something everyone sees through a different prism.
And if you think about it, like I've always, just the concept of identity in the real world is hard, because your identity is everything that everyone's ever said about you and certain qualities that you have about yourself, right? And
correct.
And so, like, what we would want if I'm going to prove to, if I'm challenged to prove to somebody else that I am me, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of relying on one credential, I would want to rely on a whole boatload of credentials that had been public before. Like you said, some could be public, some could be very private. This is not like we're putting all this information on the blockchain. But if I wanted to prove that I should be eligible to the government, that I should be eligible for benefits, rather than just providing a birth certificate, which is sort of what we would probably do now, or something like that. And I've not had to prove this because I'm fortunate in the position I am in the world, but there should be an easy way to say that, like, yes, this person possesses a digital credential about which these 5 different entities have said, this is this person. Like, this person has been KYC'd by a bank at one point. This person got a driver's license from the state of Virginia. This person got a degree from this particular college. And so, I would have had to not just fake one of those in order to create this very credible signal of my identity. I'd have to fake all 5. And if those identities that said those attestations about me were themselves known identities that people have said things about them, you get this great web. I mean, it's a lot like the web of trust in the original cypherpunk identity scheme that unfortunately has sort of not been widely used. But it seems like the right way to build these things, right?
Absolutely. In fact, you bring up web of trust. There's a really great event that Chris Allen, former Blockstream employee, he created called Rebooting Web of Trust. And that is where we did a lot of the early meetings for a lot of this technology was Rebooting Web of Trust. You're 100% right. We want to make identity assertions and claims credentials more diffuse. We need to make it more diffuse because just like a honeypot attacker for an application like Twitter or something like that, identity itself is a honeypot today. Right. And it's siloed within institutions, which honestly are just not that great at keeping up their technological prowess. So what we want to do, and this is, you can see where Microsoft might benefit in this way. It is, when I talk about digital truth and digital lies, it is inherently the case that you can easily tell digital lies today. In fact, it's the default. Yeah. If I wanted to go tell a digital lie on LinkedIn and pretend to be Bill Gates, I could just literally look at Bill Gates' existing profile, type in all the same information. What do you know? It looks just like Bill Gates. So I can create an authentic lie very easily in today's world. It's much harder to create the truth. So once the profile of someone like Bill Gates, or they might be actually watching their profiles, but you and me and the chickens out there, we could create profiles and actually prove the assertions in there. And people can't just throw up phony things on Twitter asking for a bunch of Bitcoin or on LinkedIn claiming to be, certain people in the industry.
Yeah. I knew I made it when bots started imitating my Twitter handle. I was like, wow, that's great. I'm so excited that fake me is asking you to invest in crap. I
have not had that happen yet. I feel sad and left out.
Not to make you jealous about scammers. Scammers like me. They like Niraj way more though. So, we're all small compared to Niraj. So I think we've hinted at it, but one thing I definitely wanted to talk about before we get off this interview is, okay, so we need this blockchain for this sequentiality of data. Could we just use a permissioned blockchain? And would we get all the benefits we want from an identity system if we just used, a blockchain that was maybe like what Libra is envisioning from Facebook, where we have like a enumerated list of people that keep the record and validate transactions on it, or like Corda, R3's project. I know you're going to say we could use that, and maybe there's sometimes when we do want to use those permissioned blockchains, but are there things that permissionless blockchains, you mentioned you want to use Bitcoin in these early versions, which to me is really cool. What do you get from the permissionless Bitcoin world that maybe you don't get from Corda or Libra?
Yeah, I mean, right now we have no plans to do anything but Bitcoin in terms of our work, applying the sidetree protocol, which is a generic protocol that's blockchain agnostic, to a particular blockchain. Bitcoin produces Ion, and that's the network. It's this instantiation of sidetree. But we have no plans to move it. And the reality is about security, about permissionlessness, about how tamper evasive, not just tamper resistant, because one could claim that a permissioned blockchain is tamper resistant, right? You have to go compromise a few people,
right?
Where they, a couple governments have to get together to subpoena all the people in the 5 jurisdictions, right? Yep. It's about how tamper evasive it is. And I would argue that Bitcoin is actively tamper evasive.
I like that.
And that is what I think in an identity system you absolutely want. Your friends, your enemies, everyone wants it. You kind of look at each other and it's the Mexican standoff, right? And no matter how much you hate it for other reasons, you might not like the money piece, but you're going to love it for the identity piece.
Oh, that's great.
Those are the attributes that I think are just harnessed in Bitcoin at a magnitude that is so far greater than both other permissionless chains, but also dramatically more resistant to the things we want it to be than permission chains.
Yeah. So that I love tamper evasive versus tamper resistant, because you're right. So with a permission blockchain, even with like 20 in a round robin people who are signing blocks and adding new blocks to the chain, you're right. If all 20 of them were in one political jurisdiction, or if they were spread across four, then you've got a real vulnerability there. And we might say, well, we like the governments in those four jurisdictions, right? We might say
Yeah,
that.
all five of them, and they have eyes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very good. But we also might not like those jurisdictions. And I don't think it's right that any political jurisdiction have the last say about certain fundamental things, like proving that somebody is somebody, right? Like that's a basic humanitarian right. And so what you mean by tamper evasive, correct me if I'm wrong, is with Bitcoin, we have this, it's not a round robin where somebody is the next to sign a block and they're a known person in a certain jurisdiction. The next person to sign a block is whoever does the proof of work calculation fastest and mines the blockchain fastest, SHA-256 in the case of Bitcoin, but it could be something else. And people want to do that because they're incentivized by the payment. So this is something we often struggle with early on, where people were like, oh, I like blockchain, but I don't like the money part. I don't like the Bitcoin part. And we're like, well, you can't have an open blockchain unless people are incentivized by payments, and you got to do payments native to the blockchain. So you got to like the money part if you really want the censorship resistant part. But so because anybody could pop up next and create the next block on the blockchain, and there's this great monetary incentive to get people to do that, not only could you not easily round up all the people who are likely to sign the next block and tell them what to do, there'll always be some other person who could pop up next, incentivized by the value of creating a new block in the blockchain, and put the transaction that you didn't want put in.
Yeah, Bitcoin is like that punk at a birthday that replaced all the candles with trick candles, and you try to blow it out, and then like the incentives just force it to come alive again, and then eventually you're just like, damn it, I give up. So yeah,
Dan, you're way better at actually making this personal and relatable than I am. So I think you should come to DC and talk to congressmen. I don't know.
Oh, I can't. I don't know. I feel like I wouldn't be able to sit in a room that long and say nice things.
Fair. It's fair.
You know what I do on Twitter. It's terrifying.
It's not terrifying. It's excellent.
Okay.
Yeah. So I actually think we've reached a pretty logical stopping point. Is there anything else you wanted? I guess give our audience a little bit more research next. You mentioned Ion, and this is, so what is Ion specifically, and where can people find out more about it and maybe even start to play with it? Is it something they can play with yet?
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So Ion is the layer 2 network protocol and instantiation that we run on top of Bitcoin. Inside of Ion, it's basically, you can download it. It's a few services that run in a container. It's got Bitcoin, obviously, IPFS to do the data exchanges, and the core processing logic. And you fire it up, and it'll start reading Bitcoin and start pulling in data from IPFS and doing its thing. You can definitely kick the tires on it now because it's in beta. It's going to be firming up in Q1 2021. That's when we think the final 1.0 will go out, and that's kind of where it's just out there. I do want to underscore that there is no Microsoft in there. So like, if you lose your keys, there's no one to email. There is no one to get them back from. It is truly and 100% decentralized in that sense. So that's a big piece, right? Play with Ion. Some other big pieces, because identity has a lot of facets to it that we have to, boxes to tick. Mm-hmm. One of them is a secret recovery thing, which you talked about. We actually have this thing that's, I think, landing in the repo today, potentially, called fuzzy encryption. That is a threshold scheme that's a little bit new. Cool. If you're familiar with mnemonics, like creating a phrase with 16 words, mnemonics, just to make it really crisp, mnemonics requires you to generate your 16 words, and you got to get them all right, 100%, and in the right order, right? This scheme allows you to generate an encryption key by getting a threshold of those things right. So you could generate 16, but maybe only have to have 12 or 10, and you can get them in any order.
That's cool.
So that's going to land, and that's just an open source thing that's going to land in the repos. We're giving that away to the community, both a Python and a C library for that. Feel free for it.
Would like a practical implementation of that look like maybe if you wanted, so lots of people now do two-factor authentication, right? And it is vastly better than single-factor authentication, where you use your YubiKey or the Google Authenticator app on your phone to offer the second credential. Is it kind of like that, except you could have 10 devices and then maybe wearables or other things that are around you all the time. And as long as you still have control of 6 of them, it's sufficient for this threshold. And not only that, this is all happening like this is actual just encryption. This isn't like somebody checking a box that says, yeah, they provided 5. It's like, no, if you have 5, you have the key effectively, right?
That's correct. So not only could you get devices to be your second factor, but you can also have the second, like let's say one of my devices is a YubiKey. The same YubiKey that has this big hardware string can actually map to a human relatable string like dog. So like if I forget the YubiKey, I can actually still remember the word potentially. So not only does it mixes both the hardware factors that were unguessable previously, and the idea of mnemonics, which are, things you may be able to remember. I wouldn't advise coming up with a string of your own, but it gives you more flexibility. So absolutely. So that's one of them. The next thing we have, there's one other additional one I wanted to bring up, is that these credentials, because we want security, because we want privacy. Right now, we started out with very basic credentials where you take a piece of data, you put your ID that, who you're essentially signing it to, and you sign over it. And it's kind of just a textual thing. It's all the text is right there. It's not obscured. That's fine for things like maybe your diploma, right? Because you hang it on a wall. You want everyone to see it anyway, right? But it's not fine for other use cases that are sensitive, like maybe medical or other things. So we've been hard at work on a snark scheme for doing credential exchange that is zero knowledge proof, supports the full range of circuits. It's very performant. It's based on the peer-reviewed work we did under Spartan, which anyone who might have read about snarks might have come across Spartan. And we have a team at MSR that's going to be implementing that just after we finish the fuzzy encryption stuff and delivering that again as a completely agnostic open source solution. So anyone can create credentials that don't even link to an ID. You can prove you on the credential and you could prove some fact out of it and try to really get that out into the system so we can do this in a way that's safe for people.
So this is like, I forget who was the first to say this example, and maybe they weren't the first actually. It was the first I heard them from. It was like, if you're at a bar, bartender's like, and the bartender's like, you can't drink unless you're over 18, instead of showing the bartender like, here's my name and home address. And if you think I'm cute, you could come visit me, which is obviously undesirable. You could just provide some sort of proof that you're over 18 and it would be verifiable. And the bartender doesn't need to know your physical address, any other information on your driver's license. They just learn that fact.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all Boolean facts, and you could be as detailed as you want. You can have your full transcript and be a big giant thing and say, hey, you know what? I just want to know out of it, did you take this one class in sophomore year? And you can prove that one piece. Fact. So yeah.
That's really cool.
It's kind of cool. So awesome. That's the next, a couple of things we're doing. This whole system's coming together in 2021. Obviously, we're building products around making it easier to use, but it is all standards based. Microsoft doesn't control you. We don't own your keys, not your coins, not your keys, not your IDs. And that's what we believe in. So I really would look forward to all your listeners getting involved and hopefully contributing to the effort.
That's awesome. Yeah, I hope they will. Not your keys, not your IDs. Good note to end on. And Daniel, I'm definitely going to force you to come to DC and say nice things for too long while sitting in a chair against somebody from Congress or something like that.
I'll be there, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.